Welcome back to Beyond Your Balance Sheet from the Sedoric Group of Steward Partners Global Advisory. I'm Laura Kanoy. Beyond Your Balance Sheet explores those aspects of life in addition to your finances, which contribute to overall well-being. The Sedoric Group is sponsoring this conversation series as part of its wider goal to help clients achieve fulfilling lives. As planners, they offer financial guidance and expertise, but they also recognize the enormous importance of mind, body, heart, and soul. And so, in this episode, we focus on a workplace phenomenon that can create conflict and stress: generational differences. Our guest today is a seasoned facilitator and popular keynote speaker who finds herself asked frequently to address this topic in her work with employers around New England and the nation. We're talking with Jerry King, president of Human Dynamics Associates based in Concord, New Hampshire. Jerry is a social psychologist, organizational consultant, and author of the Book of Management and Supervision, Dispelling Common Leadership Myths. Jerry King, a huge welcome to Beyond Your Balance Sheet. It's really great to have you.
Delightful to be here, Laura.
So organizations, Jerry, often call you in to come in as a kind of therapist to help them with all sorts of problems. How much in demand is this particular topic, managing multi-generational teams?
It's, I would say, the third most requested topic, and that's been true for the last couple of years. I do not have the stats. Post-COVID, pre-COVID, it's the first time in American history we've had 4 and 5 generations in the workplace because people weren't retiring as early. And it brought up all sorts of issues that were unanticipated.
Wow. So talk a little bit more about that, Jerry, that this is a phenomenon that we have not perhaps seen before.
It isn't, and I find it fascinating because people are, from my perspective, thankfully, more politically correct about other kinds of groups. I should explain, more politically correct. I like that because it reminds us. I am reminded, if I have to stop myself from saying something, that perhaps I shouldn't be thinking it. So that's why I say thankfully. However, they are not more politically correct about age and age differences. What fascinates me about this is we will not be another ethnicity. We will not be another race. Most people will not be another gender. We were all younger and we're all getting older. So we all will either belonged or will belong to the groups that people are distressed about. So I'm wondering if it's based in fear or jealousy.
That's interesting. So people say things about other generations that they wouldn't dream of saying about people of other races or ethnicities or genders or so forth.
That's right. And I laugh because periodically I'm working with a group and they're complaining about an older person who's younger than I. And so for a while, I'm feeling great, I'm thinking to myself, oh, they don't know they're insulting me. And then at one moment, I thought to myself, wait a minute, would I feel great if somebody said something anti-Semitic because they didn't know I was Jewish?
Right.
Of course not.
Right.
So when that happens, my response is, I hope I'd be just as offended even if I weren't Jewish, and I hope I would. I am a little perplexed about how to respond to ageism. I don't want to be hurtful to people. I don't want to upset them. Somehow, however, we have to let them know that that's happening.
So where does that feeling of freedom to make disparaging remarks about people of other generations, where does that feeling of freedom that it's okay to do that come from, Jerry, when, again, in the workplace, most people wouldn't dream of, saying racist comments or sexist comments?
Of course. I'm not sure. And if I were doing another dissertation, I would do it on that topic.
Right.
I think that people are terribly annoyed and or envious of other generations. So what I hear is the younger generation doesn't have a good work ethic, which is not true. However, they do work differently. What I hear younger people say about older people is, oh, they're over the hill or they don't like change. Let me talk about change for a minute, because the second most requested topic I get is accommodating and responding to change. When they say older people may be more resistant to change, younger people, especially if they're new in the organization, never experience the other way. So they're not making a change. I am somewhat heartened. I do have to say, I was working with a group where they were very upset about this person who had been there some 45 years and was retiring. And the organization decided to do this, now does this with all retirees. The last 3 months of tenure is entirely devoted to sharing institutional wisdom. So that this man started doing it, he had no idea how much he knew, by the way, because it was just part of who he was. The people who couldn't wait for him to get out of there were hanging on every word, literally begging him not to retire.
Wow. So
I know.
validating him.
Validating him and appreciating him. And so now what they do is they gather together new people. Not all the new people are young, of course, in an organization, but mostly they are. They gather together for a lunch every month and they share institutional wisdom. And I encourage them with the newer folks to encourage them to ask questions. When a person new to the organization says, is there a reason you do this way? And our only answer is we always have. We might want to investigate that.
So it sounds like it needs to be intentional, though, Jerry. You know, management needs to intentionally say, this could be an issue, and we are going to create a positive out of what has been a negative.
I love the way you put that. I really think for us to look and see what do we need from each other? How can we use each other? And I use this quote because in the best sense of the word. And, I gave the example of, is there a reason you do this? We always have. One of my favorite little stories that depicts that is the two people making a pot roast, and before putting it in the oven, one slices off the end. The other person says, what are you doing? I don't know, my folks did it. His folks say grandparents did it. So they call grandparents and they say, we're making your pot roast and we're slicing off the end. We don't know why. And grandpa said, I don't know why you do it. We did it because our pan was too small. So in organizations, things started for good reason. Those reasons still exist.
Oh, that's funny.
And
you're
can
not
we
going to
start
believe this.
exploring that?
Yeah. I literally just put a pot roast in the oven before I started this interview, but that's another story. Getting back to, again, organizations calling you in and saying, Jerry King, help, we need help with this. What sorts of conflicts typically come up, Jerry? What are you hearing about?
Well, just to say a little something about conflict. Conflict is rarely about the issue. It's usually about how it's handled. It's about stylistic difference. Now, our styles are often associated with our generations, how people talk to each other, how they respond to each other. I'll give you an example to which we can all relate. A lot of conflict is happening via email and text because that's what we're all doing now. I'm as addicted as everyone else. Younger people, even more so, because this has been their life. People read the email in the mood they're in, not in the mood it was sent. And so when you do that, I promise very little, but I do promise it will not get better if there's tension. So when there's tension, stop after 2 exchanges and talk to each other. So what's happening now is things on email and particularly on text, because it's so directive, sound like accusations. And if there's any tension around the cultural difference or the generational difference, it's often then associated with that.
Wow. So obvious question from that, Jerry, is how much has the pandemic increased some of these intergenerational misunderstandings or conflicts?
Well, now I do want to say Zoom has saved us, no question about it. So of email and text, these last couple of years, we wouldn't have been able to function. However, creativity has been limited because we're not all in the office together. We're not around the coffee pot saying, I have this great idea, let's sit down and talk and start including other people. When we'll use multi-generations, when they're all in the office, you're much more likely to pass someone's office and say, hey, come with us, talk to us. It's much more selective on Zoom.
Interesting. Yeah, go ahead,
Right.
Jerry. You had something else you wanted to say there.
Right. So you're more apt to leave people out that somehow you don't associate with.
Right,
Yeah,
right. And speaking of technology, I mean, I myself have been guilty of this. Earlier on, say 10 years ago or so, I would be in a meeting in a multi-generational team, and the young people would all be looking at their phones. And
right.
the older people, someone would be talking. And to my eyes, it felt rude. But then I said something to a younger colleague who I knew
Yeah.
and trusted, and she said, actually, they were looking up a fact on the topic that the person was speaking about. So they were sort of
Yes,
they were participating,
participating.
but to my eyes, it looked like they were being rude and not paying attention.
Exactly. Or I was just yesterday in a group where someone said, and probably should have said earlier, I'm taking notes on my phone. And
Right,
so encouraging people to say, what are you doing with your technology if that's what you're doing? Now, if I'm taking notes on a paper, you see that.
right,
You say
right,
something, I write it down, it seems quite obvious. So, what we have to do, I think, is to say, good for you, Laura, for saying, I have some problems with what you're doing so that they can then explain.
right.
Now, it works better if you explain earlier. You may not know what to explain. It may not even occur to someone that you didn't know that's what they were doing on their phone. Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah.
Do
And
the
younger generations, by the way, can multitask
Yeah,
better. So I can't. If I was with a group ages ago where people were knitting, and I finally stopped the group and I said, just so you know, if I were knitting, I wouldn't be able to pay attention to a single other thing. So I presume you can't either. They said that's not true. However, we appreciate the fact that you're looking through your eyes.
that's really
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah. So did these type of um, intergenerational problems, conflicts, misunderstandings, whatever you want to call them, Jerry, do these tend to come up more in nonprofits, for profits, governmental agencies? Have you noticed any differences in your work?
I'm asked that about a lot of issues, and I have to tell you, I do not see a difference. I hesitate to say it because people feel unique, and I feel badly saying we're not as unique as that. People are people, to use a cliche, and I see it everywhere. It's interesting that you mentioned therapist. I used to be a psychotherapist, and I'm so grateful for that background, particularly family background when it comes to working with organizations. That's what it feels like. Our first group were families, and so that's how we learned to be in a group. And I often bring that up with groups. So how many siblings did you have? And people start, oh, that's why I'm responding to that department that way. They
Oh,
got a bigger
that's
piece of the
interesting.
cake. Yeah, right.
Oh, that's interesting. That's
Yeah,
interesting. So you talked earlier about some stereotypes, Jerry.
yeah,
Older workers might feel that younger workers don't have as strong a work ethic.
right.
Younger employees may feel like the older generation doesn't want to learn. What other stereotypes do you sort of have to bust up when you come into an organization?
Well, some of their reactions are based on their upbringing. So I hear someone who's of an older generation say, can't believe these younger people are saying, I'm leaving right on the dot at 5 o'clock to make my kid's soccer game. I couldn't go to my kid's soccer game. And so I have a discussion with them about that. Is this envy?
Mm.
Are we? And I remember saying to my kid when he was a teenager, hanging out, he never put out the trash. I said, Ethan, I wish I could hang out with my friends and not put out the trash. And then I realized that was true. I really did. And so I see it in the workplace as well, where people finally admit, do you know how hard it was to go through my whole career, miss so much of my children's lives? And now I see younger people insisting on it.
Very
And
interesting.
once it's out, you begin to see the reactions and the reason for it.
Wow. So what are the reactions? You talked about the reasons, which sound
Right,
like envy that you might
right.
not have had that experience, but go ahead. Yeah.
I think it's also this feeling of work-life balance, which sort of relates to the statement that I just gave. I'll give you another example that comes from my personal life. When our son graduated college, it was during a recession. And we went to the graduation party they gave, he and his roommates, and they were standing around, and a lot of his friends were saying, I will never, ever be loyal to a company. So I walked over and said, tell me. And they said, my parents got up early in the morning, came back late at night, Instead of a gold watch, they were downsized. What that reminded me of, and I continually remind groups of, is we all have societal influences. We are all, depending on our generation, responding to different scenarios. That is how we became who we are. And that's often why our perspective is different from an older generation or a younger generation.
I'd like to hone in for just a minute, Jerry, on the idea of respect. And in
Mhm.
your talks, I know you discuss this, that different generations in the workplace have very different ideas of what constitutes respect. So,
Right.
what behaviors or situations tend to raise this issue?
Well, I think we have to be more specific. I laugh when I see HR manuals that say people have to dress professionally. What does that mean, depending on your
Right,
generation? I
right.
mean, in my father's generation, it was a tie and a three-piece suit. Now it's if you're mostly covered, that's great. I mean, what we can't be that general. We have to be somewhat specific, and it's not an unusual question to say, what is the reason for this?
Mm,
And if we
that's
can't
interesting.
answer it, then maybe we have to have a conversation and a discussion about it. Now, there are times when people will say, the reason is that this is just what we do here. Can you continue it because we're used to it? I also think that we give children double messages. We tell them when they want to wear something we don't like, well, you don't have to dress just like your friends. And then we get dressed up like our friends and go to work.
What I love these sort of mythologies that you're raising and stereotypes and beliefs that people have. What happens, Jerry, when you go into an organization and you start to bust these myths up and people
Uh-huh.
start going, oh, that's why she blah blah blah, or that's why he might react badly in that situation. What happens when people start being more honest about some of these generational and frankly cultural differences?
That's so important because it explains, first of all, I think curiosity. If you had to have one aspect in a workplace, how about curiosity? To be curious about it. Tell me more about that. So it explains it. Now, when we explain those things, they're not excuses, they are explanations. An excuse is, this is who I am, you just have to live with it. Explanation is, this is who I am, this is who you are. How do we negotiate that? So if I have discomfort with something, are you willing to accommodate me? And if I'm your boss, of course, I can say you just have to do it. That doesn't work for very long, by the way, especially in this day and age when people change jobs a lot. So how about if we get into a negotiation? If we talk about our comfort levels, our discomfort, are you willing to accommodate this? Now, speaking of respect, I do have to add this. People think respecting older people is not arguing with them. I have to tell you something that my grandmother taught me when she was in her 90s. She said, I knew I was old when people let me get away with things they did not let me get away with when I was younger. And she was a lovely woman, so this was uncharacteristic. We were with a group of people. She said, watch this, Jerry. And she said something absolutely outrageous. And people said, oh, oh.
That's so cute.
Yes, and it drove her crazy. She said, I'm being treated like a 2-year-old. So her message was, it is disrespectful not to argue with someone who's older. You should do it in a respectful way, but that should be true no matter what the age.
Interesting.
And I have carried that with me. So, and I bring this up with multi-generations and say, please, if you disagree with someone, if they're okay with it, tell them.
Oh, go ahead, Jerry.
No, that was it. The came for no reason.
We're talking a lot, about misunderstandings, conflicts that come up, but you in your work really like to focus on multi-generational teams as a
Yeah.
huge source of strength. So, what's the potential there?
So much. Consider that you're new to a job and that you happen to be younger. Consider how quickly you would learn that if you had a mentor. Now, I want to say something about mentors. Certainly, supervisors are mentors. The best mentorship programs also include people who are not your supervisor, so that you don't have to worry about that, or it's going to show up in your performance evaluation if you ask a question 4 times, whatever it is. So good mentorship programs include your supervisor. However, they also include mentors outside, often outside your department, if the organization is big enough. And what a mentor does is share their experience and what happened as a result, paying attention to the fact that it may be different now, depending on the era that we're in. So mentorship programs help conversations, continue conversations, curiosity, as I mentioned. And I don't mean, why did you do this? You'll probably hear me, I break my own rule. Why questions are usually perceived as accusations. So when you say, why did you do this? Why did you say this? What I really mean is I don't like what you said and I don't like what you do.
Oh,
So
what's a better
people,
way to say it?
so tell me what's going on. Take me
Mm,
through your process. Share what you know.
mm.
And if I say why, which I may before the end of this, by the way, and it doesn't work, how about if I say, oh, you're right, let me try it a different way. And what you think is, oh my gosh, she's trying. She cares enough about our relationship that she's trying. And this is one of the things that happened during Zoom time, is we weren't having conversations that were not office or policy or directive related. So I have encouraged, and many places do this now, they have a Zoom gathering that has nothing to do with work. What movies did you see? What are you thinking about? How was your weekend?
Mm.
That is not a waste of time. That is the best use of our time if we're building teams.
So mentorship can unleash the power really of
Really is.
multi-generational teams.
Yeah.
What about reverse mentorship? Younger people, talking with older workers about their knowledge and their skills. I guess what I'm trying to say is mentorship can be a two-way street.
It certainly can. Thank you for bringing that up. Very few people realize that. If I'm older than you, and it turns out I am, and I'm mentoring you, then how about if we turn it around and I say, now you tell me from your perspective, what have you learned? What kinds of things have you accommodated? What is your perspective? What I keep saying to people is, together you are one perfect person.
Mm. You mean the team, the whole
The team,
multi-generational
the
team is one
group, the
perfect
various
person.
generations, we are
Right.
one perfect person. Are we fortunate to have representatives from different, in this case, different eras?
Right,
Yeah.
right. I remember a younger colleague showed me how to do cool things on Instagram, and I
There
was
you go.
thrilled to learn that from
That's right.
her.
There you go.
So,
Yeah.
although I do wonder, Jerry, is it possible that sometimes, the older workers don't speak up because they don't want to be perceived as the fuddy-duddy, the naysayer, the cranky person who says that doesn't work, we tried it 10 years ago, even though maybe the idea at hand really is a bad idea and they tried it and it didn't work. So I
That's
wonder
right.
if older people are censoring themselves.
That's another question I'm often asked instantly is, what about the resistance to change? Now, just as an aside, there's a trade-off with every change, even positive change, even if it's giving up the familiar. So knowing that we can't change anything without there being a trade-off. What happens when we look at that is, how about if we find out what the trade-off was during the time when they tried it, and decide if that's still true. Now, there are times, and I've had people admit this to their credit, where they have pushed back because continuous improvement, as we know, which is wonderful effort, is continually improving. However, people who have been there for a long time often perceive it as an indictment. Are you saying the way I did it for 25 years was wrong?
Oh, that's interesting.
And
Yeah.
sometimes they will resist because they'd rather be perceived as cantankerous than incompetent.
Whoa, say more about that, Jerry.
Well,
They'd rather be
ima-
seen as cantankerous and incompetent.
well, imagine you have done something for 25 years. You've had a role, you've been doing this, and all of a sudden there's a new way to do it. You're having trouble accommodating that. And the person who's been there 6 months is doing a better job than you. I mean, think about what that feels like. And that's the other conversation we have. What does it feel like to have that happen? Instead of just saying this change isn't okay. I do want to go back to when people say we tried it 10 years ago and it didn't work. How about if we dig more into that? What about it didn't work? Well, it didn't work for these 3 reasons. Well, 2 of those reasons have been taken care of. Then that's what I mean by negotiating and having a conversation. However, you're right. The third one still prevails. Thank you for bringing that up.
What about basic human resources policies, insurance, vacations? How can those be better fit to suit multi-generational teams, Jerry?
We have to ask them what they need and what they want. And look at when it was written, by the way, or was it written based on the past? Again, we have new requirements. I mean, when we think about young people, I'll give you an example. I was working in New York City. I got out early, so I went to Rockefeller Center to watch people skate. And there were some 18 and 19-year-olds standing next to me. And one of the guys said, yeah, really, no kidding. Absolutely fish. No. And the woman across from him said, I know. To which I said, you do? There was not a noun or verb in that sentence. What do you know? And they looked at me like it was none of my business, because indeed it was none of my business. What I realized is if they'd been talking Swedish or they'd been talking another language of any kind, I would not have expected to understand them.
Mm-hmm.
They were speaking English. They were Americans, and I did not understand them. And that was sort of that click kind of thing. Are we willing to admit that? Are we willing to say that word meant something entirely different when I was growing up?
That's interesting. And so we have to be willing to say, I don't get it.
I don't get it. And people will say, well, how can I be here for 40 years and admit not getting it? This is one of the leadership issues, that you have to look like you have it all together all the time, or always in charge. If we present that, we're lying. It's not true. It can't be.
So since you mentioned leaders, I did want to ask you, Jerry, what about organizational leaders who are, trying to accomplish the mission? Everybody's short-staffed these days, it seems. Right. What's your best advice for them, Jerry, to sort of get the most out of their multi-generational teams?
Ask for help. It is a gift when you ask for help. Think about your personal life. If someone asks me for help, the message also is I can ask for help when I need it. If someone never asks me for help, the message is I should not do that either. So think about that. Think about being willing to say, this is new and I don't get it. I don't understand it. Shared power is what I encourage. Power is the ability to influence. So shared power is influence based on expertise, not on role. It's based on knowledge, not position. If I'm in charge and it's your area of expertise, you have and should have more power than I do. And as a leader, I can't know everything. How could I? Or I wouldn't be able to do my own job.
Okay, so that raises something else I wanted to ask you, Jerry. When leadership promotes a younger person over an older person, what's the best way to navigate that? You just said power is based on experience and expertise.
All right.
The older person may have the experience and the expertise.
It's funny. Younger people ask me that a lot. And I say, did anybody else vie for that job? And the older person vied, and nobody did. So they were promoted not because they were in a contest with someone. I encourage them to sit with that person and say, this is really uncomfortable for me because of our age difference. Is it uncomfortable for you? Same thing when you're promoted and now you're supervising your peers. Say to them, this is weird for me. This is strange. Is it for you? And if it is, keep talking about it. And sometimes we find out it's not an issue at all.
Wow, that just opens up a whole well of honesty that's so rare in the workplace. Everybody just kind of wants to have their head down and do the job. I'm just imagining some of the responses that you would get if you said, look, this is a little awkward for me. Is it awkward for you?
Right. And so at least find out if it is. And then if it is, the conversation goes further. Because I've heard people say, the reason I didn't apply for that job is I don't want it. I love what I do. I am not interested in doing something else. And being a leader is a very different job. People are promoted because they're good at their jobs. Being a leader is a very different job for which, by the way, practically nobody is trained
Yeah. Boy, that's the
in any field.
that's a whole nother topic, isn't it,
Right.
Jerry? The idea that people are really good at what they do and then they get promoted to management, and sometimes they're great managers and leaders and sometimes they're not.
Right.
So,
Not usually because they were trained, not grad schools don't do that. I said to a law school dean one day, apparently you expect all your graduates to remain at the entry level. He said, of course not. I said, I find it interesting. You're not giving them any management skills.
right,
Right.
right. Well, we'll set
Yeah.
that aside for another day. What about the individual worker, Jerry, who might be coming home and, grumbling to their family that older colleague is a pain in the neck and doesn't want to do anything, or that younger colleague is always looking at their phone and not paying attention. What's your best advice for the individual worker who may be frustrated with a colleague from another generation?
So I've been working a lot with creating blame-free and gossip-free work environments, and they're really easy to understand, very hard to do. Gossip-free is you talk to people instead of about them. And so if you come to me, Laura, because you're upset with someone, my response should be, how can I help you figure out how to talk to them? Talking to me about these people is not helpful. And by the way, we mentioned supervisors. People talk to their supervisors consistently about their colleagues. How about if the supervisor says, how can I help you talk to your colleague
Mm,
directly? So that's the point, is that I'm venting, I'm getting it out. However, I haven't solved the problem. In fact, if you then support me, oh, you're right, that person's terrible, awful, I have a bigger problem. Because now I really believe my prejudice and discrimination, and now what do I do about it?
yeah, now you've got a huge chip on your shoulder.
I
So,
do, and we know that it doesn't help. So people say, well, what if it doesn't work once we talk to each other? Well, you know where you were when you started,
right, right.
right?
And
What if it
conflict at
doesn't work?
work, you just bring it home with you, and it's a
Oh,
huge source of stress.
and
So,
also, when we're upset, we release cortisol. And when it doesn't go in the right direction, now primitively, that was so we could flee or fight. When we have nothing else to do with it, it just hurts our bodies.
yeah.
So, how about if I come back to work and I say to my colleagues, this is really bugging me, this is really bothering me. Do you think there is anything we can do about it?
Is there anything else, Jerry, that you really want people to keep in mind when they are a member of a multi-generational team and they may be kind of sorting it out?
I do not use the term that most people use, would treat people the way you expect to be treated. Because what if you expect to be treated badly?
There is that.
Then you're doing it. I take with me, and by the way, this sounds like I do it right all the time, and that's absolutely not true. By the way, this is how I know what doesn't work. But I take with me, I'll give you an example. Prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is generalizing about a group, discrimination is acting on it. If I don't want to act on it, I have no choice but to admit that I have that prejudice. So let's say it's about another generation. Now it's hard. Most of us are not happy with any prejudices we have. So it's very embarrassing even to ourselves, even if we don't tell anybody else, to admit it. I don't know how to stop myself from acting poorly toward a person until I say to myself, you know what? I'm generalizing about this person's generation. That's what's going on. So now what are we going to do about it? Not what am I going to do about it? You, the
Wow.
person that I'm having trouble with, how can we resolve this? And it's not going to happen just like that. So, Monday through Thursday, I might be fine. Friday, I might go back to old behavior. There are two ways to handle it. Either, see, Jerry, you never changed, or wow, we haven't seen that for 4 days. And then we'll continue, hopefully, to build on that.
Wow. So all about just really being honest about what's going on in your
Right.
own psyche around this, and then not being afraid to come forward and talk honestly with the person about it.
Right. And learn from it And assumption, do need to say one more thing about assumptions. Assumptions are guesses we begin to believe. So as soon as I see, we'll use the generational piece because that's what we're talking about. As soon as I see someone of a certain generation, I'm making a lot of assumptions about who I think that person is, how I think that person thinks, how I think that person is going to act. I don't know that.
Right.
I'm truly making this up. So again, if we're going to have an ongoing relationship, how about if we check that out? And if you say, yes, number 3, I am going to do that. How about if I say, I'll have a lot of problems if you do, and you're going to see it in my body language. By the way, we don't see our own, we only see each other's. And so point it out. If you see me looking grouchy when you do that, how about if you just let me know?
It gets back to that spirit of curiosity you talked
It
about.
is,
Right
and
at the
sharing
beginning.
and honesty and hope.
Well, Jerry, we could have talked a lot longer. It's been really just wonderful to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Fun. Thank you, Laura, for inviting me. It was delightful. Thanks.
Thanks also to our engineer, RJ Perkins, and to the Sedoric Group of Steward Partners for sponsoring this series. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you'll join us for the next episode of Beyond Your Balance Sheet. Keep your eyes on this website for more information. I'm Laura Kanoy. Thanks, everybody, for being with us.